I'm told some see as a covert attempt to represent the most avant-garde architects in Iran, which actually, if you add Farshid Mousavi, Bram Chadel, and Nasrine Seraji together, probably does represent the most avant-garde architects in Iran, practicing anywhere. Some thought it was a kind of feminist plot. Too many women architects. It was a nice balance. The nice thing about the AA is that, of course, none of us actually think in these terms at all. We just enjoy the work and enjoy the courage that is behind it. I first met Nasrine, who is a graduate of the AA, when she had this wonderful idea with Irene Scalber to somehow offer Paris to essentially the American academic world. But in so doing, she showed me a number of projects that seemed exquisite. And I have learned since of the extraordinary struggles that some of these projects involved. Probably the most impressive one was her success in winning the temporary building for the American Center. I think it was in Raspail. Was it in Raspail in Paris? Which the future architect of the permanent center tried very hard to wrestle away. I'm sure she has a different way of viewing it, but there are struggles going on. I thought her project for the foyer competition was by far the best, and I think it's an extraordinary imagination. I'm very pleased with the way that has played out in the teaching here. So it's with great pleasure I introduce Nasrine Seraji.
Does this thing work, Joel, or?
Yeah, it works. You made it work. First, I called the lecture Diversion because there have been a series of diversions since 1957 when I was born in Tehran. 1958 I learned to speak Persian, and in 67 I actually learned to speak English. In 74 I graduated from I graduated from school, and I attempted medical school for a couple of years until I realized that medicine wasn't really the field for me, and maybe I should take another line and come to the Architectural Association and do architecture. I graduated in '83 and started to search my practice, actually. I left England in '88 and thought that I have to learn French if I'm going to be practicing in France, since I didn't speak a word of French at that time. And somehow started to think about opposing ideas, which maybe Bahram would be against to call dialectics, but some of us would call dialectics. I didn't know whether I should start this lecture by one or the other quote. Therefore, I decided to read both of the quotes for you. When I don't understand, I get bored. When I understand, I admire. To be in the world is a bore, but to be outside of it is a tragedy. Both of the quotes are by Wilde and Oscar Wilde. And they somehow resume these diversions that I'm going to be talking about and showing you tonight. So let's just start not through slides, but through a history of how I've ended up both at the school and also within my practice. I believe that the challenge of both teaching and practice today is to address the contemporary search for new forms in architecture. I believe these new forms are already in the making through existing social and political contexts, not through the authority of the master or the star architect. Practice can no longer afford the singularity of one mind. The need for a field of interaction will necessarily create a new perception of space and hence its form. The negation of conventions result in acts, and these acts could be taken as very specific social and political positions, which I believe students should be taught. There are teachers of methodologies, and this is a discussion that we had some time ago with Jeff, in fact. I think that there are teachers of methodologies, which I would, in brackets, call techniques. And there are teachers of personal research or experience. I have personally benefited from those who have taught me to have a methodology and a critical mind, to react and enact in order to implement and realize good ideas. And I wish to convey this to our students, not only Diploma Unit 1, but all students. Having graduated from the AA, I started paying my debts. All of you know that the diploma and the RAB are very, very expensive. First, I worked in a shoe store, which lasted about 3 days. And it was then that I was called to exercise my graphic skills, since I was coming out of the AA, on a competition for a couple of young architects in London. Then I worked for a firm called Covell Matthews Wheatley that went bust about 6 years ago, with the economical crisis. And at that time, there was a group of us at Covell Matthews. We had created a little tiny AA group and complained enough to keep us sane within this commercial office. After a couple of years of keeping my bank manager happy, only by accident and following a series of events, I found myself in Australia designing a house for a very, very wealthy, eccentric man who had never, ever read a book in his life and used to give generous presents to his plumbing contractors. He used to give BMWs just because of the fact that they had repaired a leak on a Christmas Eve. In 1988, I was shortlisted for an ideas competition to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. I had also fallen in love, and the only way that I could have a visa to go and see my lover was to win a competition at that time. The French Foreign Ministry officially invited me to go to Paris, since I was holding a Persian passport. It was absolutely impossible at the time to actually leave England. And so I got to France. I'm in France, it's 1988, and I don't speak French, and I'm pretty fed up with working for architects who only think about pounds to the square meter. Since I had earned enough money in this country to take a few months off, I started learning French and looking at the way that the architectural practices were operating in France at the time. Nevertheless, I had to start working for a couple of young architects, and it only lasted until I won a competition for them, and they decided that they were going to actually subcontract the work to somebody else, and therefore they got rid of me. It was quite difficult to accept that I was being put aside after having won this competition for them single-handedly, because I had only worked on it myself. But then I left the office and took a very serious vow that I would never, ever again work in an office. And it really was the beginning of the establishment of my studio. I started with one table in the corner of a studio of a friend who was practicing at the time. I was teaching 4 months a year at the time, a program of the University of Toronto, which held a visiting program in Paris at the time. And started to send off dossiers for French competitions, and soon gave up after about 3 months, because I realized that I actually couldn't be shortlisted without having realized any buildings, and that the competitions were geared towards a very, very specific type of practice that had proved themselves. It was one afternoon in the office, an architect friend came in and asked me if I knew an interior designer. And I asked what it was for. It turned out to be a little complicated £80,000 conversion for a young couple. So that's where basically the building work started. I'm going to now start showing you some of the slides, especially with the first competition that I won, which took me to France. And then I will show you 10 projects. I will try to be very, very brief because I want us to finish in exactly 1 hour and 3 minutes at the latest. And so please stop me if you want, but try to keep into the time, otherwise we'll have a discussion afterwards. What I will do is that I will basically read to you the main ideas that have been part and parcel of these competitions and the projects, which have been parts of the reports written on them, or what one calls reports, or the intention in order to submit the competition. At some points I will interject into these readings the writings that have actually been introduced in publications on the projects. It will only happen on 2 or 3 projects, otherwise they will be basically the written parts explaining basically the intention and the idea of each project. So this was the competition for the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. And the idea was a link, a mediator, a balance. I had started the expression of the project through a written piece by a quote from Gabriel Désiré Labardon. Art, the expression of society, manifests in its highest soaring the most advanced social tendencies. It is the forerunner and the revealer. Therefore, to know whether art fulfills its proper mission as initiator, whether the artist is truly of the avant-garde, one must know where humanity is going, know what the destiny of human race is. This was a bridge, a link, a mediator, a balance between the memory of 1789 and the vision of the future, or perhaps just a walk or a promenade on a sunny July afternoon over the Seine. The journey starts from the right banks of the river Seine, under the Pont de la Concorde, on the axis of the Place de la Concorde and the Assemblée Nationale, ascending to viewing platforms emerging from a monolithic vertical stage positioned to depict the Colonne de Juillet over the roofscape of the city. The images attempt to accentuate the visual significance of the existing and proposed axes in the urban context of Paris. The visitor is thus directed towards a memorable, intense past, continuing his promenade by crossing a tensile structure with a transparent skin. He's given the opportunity to juxtapose in his mind the event of 1789 against his present social context and freedom. He's constantly provoked by the juxtapositioning of various contributions in the artistic and scientific fields, 10 exhibition niches, which were actually the 10 exhibitions that they were going to hold after the announcement of the winners of the competition, vis-à-vis the Declaration of Human Rights in the confines of a projected facsimile on 17 screens across. The second project was, in fact, the 80,000 conversion job as an interior job. The apartment, which is situated on a 5th floor of a typical Parisian block in the 5th arrondissement of Paris, was about 80 square meters. The demolition of all the partition walls, which in the old apartment, there were actually 4 rooms, permitted to demonstrate the simplicity of an L-shaped plan generously lit in this apartment. The various spaces of the apartment are characterized via the play of light and the juxtapositioning of different materials. The apartment is organized around the corridor, which is distinguished through the treatment of its floor by moving into the kitchen, the bathroom, and arriving at the bedroom, actually. The ensemble of the project, or the intention mainly of the project, was to have a variety of readings through the apartment and not a unified one through the materiality of. This is a view from the bathroom onto the corridor, which then ends up in the bedroom. And this is a view back from the bedroom to towards the living room, actually. American Center, the apartment was being finished. I was being sued by the neighbors upstairs and was at the same time teaching 3 days a week and didn't know where to find the second job. When I think he's back there, I saw him coming in, Don called. He was, at the time, he was really the savior because he had been approached by the American Center and was asking me if I wanted to do this competition, which they weren't going to pay and wasn't perhaps just was just going to perhaps be an ideas competition. And it was then which I learned to actually never say no, because of all the tension, because of the apartment in terms of the neighbor's floor coming down. Anyway, I said yes, and I said, yeah, go ahead, please do give my name to the American Center, and we'll see what happens. This was in December 1990, and I won the competition in April 1991, and the building was actually handed over in December of 91. Now, the site is a tiny triangular site which sits right in front of the Gehry building as the continuation of this other triangular island, which is in fact the only part of the 12th arrondissement which is left in its original context and with its original buildings. Otherwise, the rest of the area all around the site has been modified and developed since about 8-9 years ago. Hopefully you'll get a good vision of all of these buildings around in the 12th arrondissement when Barber's Guide comes out soon, I hope. These simulations of the way that the building was actually constructed are a series of drawings showing the main platform starting from the corner on the left-hand side with the trees, going up to the build-up of these modules onto the end section of the American Center. So it's a series of layers that basically begin to slowly build up. With the arrival of the modules, then the whole of the plane gets completely sculpted in a different sense. The idea there was, the main idea for the American Center started by having two separate structures, one the modules, the other one the structure actually of the roof. And slowly as the design began to actually develop, the two structures became one. Here again, There's there's an example of an overlay to show not only all the views, the photographs of the existing building, but also the construction method and the system that these layers come together. Here we've got again a very, very true example of what the construction method was. It's a model which is actually which we actually made at 1 to 20. The model scale is 1 to 20, but then the materials are all of true scale. Therefore, the materiality of this sectional model was at a 1 to 1 scale, but then the model itself was just representing basically the construction method. It's just another view of the model on the other side. Now, when I won the competition in April, I had, after about a year and a half, I had booked myself to go to the States to see my family, and I was searching very, very with difficulty to see how we were going to finish this this building. And when I was in the States traveling, there was this house that was just being built, and the material that you see inside actually being used as just partition walls, which then gets covered with insulation and completely then with plasterboard, was the material that I was looking for to actually finish the building. So I went onto this site, picked up a piece of this particle board, sent it back to Paris, and asked the people that were working with me at the time in the office to actually see if we could find it. When I got back, the material was there, all polished in the form that you actually see on the building later on. So here we start the construction. The modules arrive on site, basically prefabricated, and as you see, the structure of the roof is pretty primitive, and the two people that you see sitting on those masts are basically bolting the pieces, finishing them with just a point of solder, almost like a big 1-to-1 scale model. So this is the building before it's dressed actually completely in its structure. The modules were arriving onto site with all the window sections completely boarded up in order to protect their arrival. Since building, actually, I had problems finding one contractor which was going to contract the full building in such a short time. Therefore, we split the building in 2 bits, and this end piece was contracted to one contractor, and the front piece, which you'll see later on, was another company. So one set was coming from Strasbourg, which is in the northeast of France, and the rest of the building, the front bit of the building, was coming from Lyon. They were very, very late with the construction, and therefore these modules, I mean, the building particles were actually being put on the truck at about 12 at night. And they had to arrive within 3 hours to Paris, because we only had between 4 o'clock and 5:30 in the morning to assemble these and to put them in place. So that's 2 of those modules superimposed and completely dressed. So this is a view coming from the Ministère des Finances towards the public entry of the building, which then is playing on, just on the nose of the building. You have the ascent of the staircase, which takes you to the public entry, which is this staircase, in fact, which takes you up to the first floor, which is the public entry, and also the completely blind side of the building is the temporary exhibition as well. And this is the administrative, or if you like, or the American Center employees entry, which then became two entries. The two entries actually became the summer and the winter entry by the virtue of the use of the building. Then this, as you arrive onto the exhibition hall, then there's a staircase which brings you down onto this corridor. You pass in front of the entry, this pigeonholes in this entry, and this is exactly the reverse of the same corridor, which happens right behind the skin of the building, or the facade, which is in a PVC, or the brand name is actually called Mackerel, and it's a sandwich of composite, which is quite translucent and not transparent at all. Arriving from the main reception, you arrive into the main courtyard, which then the modules embrace this triangular courtyard in the middle, which is covered but not completely rainproof or windproof. Therefore, the temperature is actually the temperature of the outside, but it's quite insulated from from the noise that was on Gary's site at the time, and also being construction site at the time. So then, if we continue the route and then come down, then we arrive at the bottom layer of the courtyard, which gives the entry to these singular modules, which are the offices. So each module is in fact an office of 3 meters by 4.5 meters width and length, and 3 meters high as a finished, and a 2.775 ceiling height, in fact. The stairs came in bits and pieces as well, and every part that you see is in fact just arrives on site as a kit of parts, and everything is assembled on site. So each step is in fact one piece. And this is just a view over onto the roof, and this is a view back towards the reception, and therefore a view of the courtyard. Now, what was fun for me here was in fact the play of the volume against against these doors, and against not the doors but the entry to each office, which was to completely compress this facade in such a way that the entrance to the offices would become, in fact, in reality, in their physical sense, not more than 7 centimeters thick. And therefore, the perception of the space was, of this space, this higher level court, interior court, was quite a funny one, in the sense that the perspective was completely false. At the same time, on one side you had the perception of volume, on the other side it was the flattened volume. But once you would get closer, or at night at least, with the light coming in, all of a sudden the depth of the offices would come into the space as well. So it was probably the space that I would call my favorite on this level. So yeah, this is how basically the whole thing was put together. This is the side which was right in front of Gary's building. It's funny, I keep on saying is. It reminds me of an anecdote, which when the building was demolished, then I had an office for about 2 months in Gary's American Center, and so I was facing, in fact, the building, and demolition was happening. Once the demolition was finished, for about 2 weeks, at the window I was seeing people that were still not crossing to the other side, but still going around as if the building was still there. And Took them about 3 weeks to realize that it wasn't actually there anymore. Now, American Center was finished, and I took a couple of months off, and we started working on this mega thing, which was the Bogan competition, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with not only the site but the competition. Since a lot of people entered it, I think it was something like in the region of 1,700 entries. There was no job in the office at the time, and it was a good exercise to mingle with after a tiny little 1,000 square meter of a building. I'll now do what let's do this now. Jeff said do it beforehand, but I thought it's better to, in fact. I think it would probably help. Please, yeah. Right. I start the report on the explanation of this of the Bogan competition by a quote from Camillo Sitte. Hardly anyone today is concerned about town planning as a work of art. Instead, it is seen only as a technical problem. The composition of Berlin's urban topography leads us to 4 basic elements with very specific relationships. 1, a river. 2, an island, a building, and a street. These elements have been present since the birth of Berlin. Berlin before Schenkel, Schenkel's Berlin, Berlin after the war, Berlin's wall, Berlin after the wall, and Berlin the capital. Berlin as a field of interaction. Colin Rowe in Modell für eine Stadt discusses the tables of Hannah Arendt and Le Corbusier as a field of interaction. I can't read actually, so anyway. Right. The only way to do it is to take it off. So, Colin Rowe, as I said, he discusses the tables of Hannah Arendt and Le Corbusier as a field of interaction. The first being socio-political, and the latter socio-aesthetic. We have considered the question of the German parliament as an analogy for this field of interaction, a field of interaction accounting for the relationships between the public and private realms, the relationships between buildings, objects, and their setting. A pivot point seems to have been present in the urban history of Berlin, this point being the collision of the north-south axes of Luisienstrasse and Unter den Linden, culminating in Brandenburg Gate. The city was terminated on this axis. The Berlin Wall was not very far from it, and the Tiergarten announced another realm. The Tiergarten just beyond this point, to the west of the axis, the end of the city, the beginning of the garden. The garden as a utopian representation of the city, or as its criticism. We consider the Berlin of today as the field of interaction which is the result of many superimpositions, historical, political, cultural, and so on. We have deliberately renounced the idea of creating an island with an island. We have superimposed the city grid and the garden, the public and the private, culture and politics, people and their representatives, the duality in order to create social and spatial uniformity. The Tiergarten extends itself to a natural boundary, the Spree. The axial relationship of Reichstag to the Congress Hall is our field of interaction. The figures on the field are the German parliament, the public, and the buildings, which, again, we call objects. The field is an urban park, a very wide green street. The field is contained by objects: the Reichstag, the Federal Press Conference, the Chancellery, the Congress Hall, and the Bundestag, which are the objects as you see on the plan. The field is contained by objects which are the ones, in fact, in front of this on the axis that you see there. Bundestag as a stage set. The Reichstag is the stage for Bundestag. This is an explosion of the urban block, rigorously pronounced, an extension of the existing fabric, the backstage. The audience is within our field of interaction, the public and the objects. In the middle of the competition for Bogan, there was this other one that arrived, which a friend of mine whose name is Pierre Granvaux, who's an architect teaching at Tolbiac, an urbanist of the state, which has been working in Paris for the past 35 years, and yet shortlisted almost 4 competitions out of 5, had been landed with this competition for the construction of a county hall, the county being Doubs, nearest to the city of Besançon. He didn't want to do the competition, he didn't have time for it, and he put the dossier on my desk and he said, do it and take the money for it. So Berlin was beginning to be very expensive, and I thought it was a good sort of feeder of Berlin. And so this competition came in for about 3 weeks, and we worked on it as a mediator between Berlin and the work to come. The idea was mainly to create the brief was asking for an atrium. And the competition briefs in France are very particular in the sense that you're free enough to actually to change the program, but there are key programs that one has to respect. Otherwise, they won't even pay you for the competition. Anyhow, the main idea was to somehow divert from this atrium business and create the public facilities within a central space, which is where you actually see the 2 main circulations, the red bits, which are embracing the main hall in the center. And all the other activities of the administration would then become and embrace the whole building as a whole, or this middle box as a whole. So here it's a good, if you see in the middle, that's mainly the hall. It's actually in burst. This is a bad slide, but anyway. Which happens right on the edge, and then the 2 arms, if you like, come to hold the. Now, it was situated on a site which was a green site with hectares and hectares of trees, and therefore the building elevates itself and allows the landscape to just glide underneath it, and you arrive actually at the 2nd or the 3rd level within this hall, and you diffuse into the. Then we arrive at the foyer competition, which is shortly after, about 3 months after the Berlin competition and the county hall. I don't know how many of you were actually or have read the articles that came out in the AA files, which gave the brief out. was a competition that was launched by the Architecture Foundation, and it was a foyer to house young, unemployed people of the ages between 16 to 25. Now, before I go into any sort of explanation, I'd like to just read what David Turnbull had written, or at least a part of it, just on the foyer. Seraji conceives of the foyer as a large communal house, an urban house facing onto a reinvented piece of the city, an espace trouvé. While some of the characteristic themes of modernism are worked out in her proposal, the dialectic of type and context, transparency both literal and phenomenal, here made explicit through the use of wireframe computer models, an emphasis on light and air inside the building, and explicit instrumentalism. Emerging from these is the destabilizing influence of the unconscious. It is here, in the interdependence of surrealism and modernism, that the urban house and the espace trouvé are to be found. Then he finishes the article by saying the screen for video and film projection hung in the espace trouvé launches it into the domain of Frederick Jameson's surrealism without the unconscious. If, as he suggests, one of the characteristics of late consumer or multinational capitalism is the disappearance of a sense of history, so that our society has begun to live in a perpetual present, and the surrealism of unconscious has become the hyperrealism of conscious, this foyer enshrines a paradox. It is evidently resistant to, yet tacitly participates in, the apparent irredeemability of contemporary consumer culture. Now, about the context of the site, in fact. The alignment of the principal accommodation wing with the street and its continuation along the railway bridge creates a large communal space open to the canal. The third side of which is framed by the existing Snow Hill house, which you'll just see on this side, on the left side of the screen, actually. A public passage between the inclined glass plane of the southwest wing and the railway bridge, which is between the bottom of the plan, in fact, going on the zigzag line of the of the railway bridge to towards the canal, links Water Street at the bottom of the site to the canal side. The generous space of the piazza is covered by a glazed roof, thus creating a virtual cubic volume which offers a spatial and social opening towards the canal. The sky and the city, and therefore this is what both David called, well, we call it in the project actually the espace trouvé, which is the central space between the two wings and the canal. The main intention in the scheme was to present this object as an autonomous object within its siting. At the same time, it had to somehow reconnect itself to the site and create a bridge or a link between all its four sides. Now, put the slide here because the idea of the rooms juxtaposed to the communal kitchen spaces are actually quite interesting. We had seen the communal spaces as a double height space, which are represented in the blocks, the solid blocks of the plexi. And the rooms, in fact, are embracing these solid blocks, or the double height of the kitchens in the middle. There are 4 rooms that relate to the double height space in the middle. And this was a way to not only demonstrate, but attempt to bring in the working of these 4 rooms together, as opposed to a space whereby these people would go and cook and carry on watching television and carry on with their everyday life. So these small double height spaces were actually a miniature, if you like, of the espace trouvé, or of the place of the piazza in the middle. Now, the central corridor, I mean, the whole intention was to negate the corridor in such a way that the rooms would not just become something which are adjacent to the corridor and therefore just doors onto the corridor. Therefore, the corridor starts, which is not probably a good drawing to show that, but they are interconnected, at least through the scheme, vertically, but also the corridor then becomes the external skin, as you saw somehow in the corridor of the American Center, on the side where it gives access to the rooms. Then here again, you'll see how at least through the transparency of the model, one can see how the double height spaces relate to the layering of the rooms. That's showing the main core and the main body of the 2 wings through the void space of the piazza in the middle, facing the canal. The room was organized in such a way that, or each room was organized in such a way that it was made of 3 parts, mainly the entry, the rectangle, which represents on the top right-hand corner, which in the center, in the plan, in fact, which is the bathroom and the toilet and the bathroom. Then there's a small zone in the middle, which either becomes part of the bathroom or, in fact, the study. And there's the main living area or the sleeping area, which is in the darker gray bottom part of the plan. And by using, in fact, the partition walls being part of the furniture of the room, the rooms are completely bare. At the same time, you can change the configuration according to your living habits. Here is just another another view of the model showing the double height spaces of the kitchen and the communal rooms through the spaces, and also the entry, which is happening on the first level, again raised from the street level. Now, this was a competition that we did after the foyer, shortly after the foyer, which we were shortlisted for. There were four groups actually dealing with this program. It's there were 3 small, tiny little objects that were to be placed in the Tuileries Gardens in Paris. The idea was to the layer of the garden on or the Tuileries presents itself as a very, very strong and positioned piece of landscape onto the plan of Paris. And the idea was to actually relate these 3 objects through another layer in the gardens. So this other layer of transparent layer was going to be, or at least attempting to slide through the garden and have only 3 focal points, which were the objects, the kiosk for a tiny, small 2 meter by 2 meter by 2 meter ice cream kiosk, a restaurant, and a tea room. Now, we'll see the the plan of the gardens on the top and the three objects being placed, as you see on that triangular sort of form. Now, the first part of the drawing shows, in fact, the kiosk and its details, and it was basically a block, a cube of 2 by 2 by 2, completely transparent, and the only vertical element within it was the man selling the ice cream in that corner. Now, this thing here, in fact, is one of the original kiosks that we had to keep within the confines of the competition. Now, the only important point of these kiosks in the Tuileries is, in fact, its hat, the way that it sits. There's something similar to the, what are they called, to the Colonne Maurice that you see in different parts of Paris, filled with, or at least paper-walled with advertisements. And the only essential symbol of this kiosk was, in fact, its hat. So that's the only thing we kept. And otherwise, we just took its structure out. And we brought the annex of the restaurant into under the hat of this kiosk, and a place for reading newspapers and just a coffee place. And the main restaurant was right this block here, which is a long, and I'm sorry not to have kept actually the three-dimensional or the color drawings, or having at least reproduced them before handing it to the competition, but for the competition. But the restaurant happens then as a long wagon-like transparent box, which sits again on this layer, which relates to the ground of the gardens. And then the tea room in the corner there finishes off with its vertical element as one of the trees, which is centrally located exactly within this area. The main idea here was to basically accentuate and create an inflection within the gardens, since it's a very, very ordered plan, and the only visible or visibility of anything in the garden are the trunks of the trees as you arrive at any point into the garden. So it was to create these three lit up points, in fact, at nighttime and during the day, because of their transparency and the elements within them, to just mark 3 points of accentuation within the garden. Then there was a master planning exercise that came into the office through La Première Rue and Briey, which we had actually as a group with Don and some friends at the Première Rue. We had started to convince the town hall that they shouldn't give up this 4 hectares of land to a developer who was going to give them about 2.5 million francs and just build up on the road facade, on this facade here, a commercial center, as he called it, and then leave the rest of the site alone. So through a series of negotiations and conversations with the town hall and presentations, one presentation after the other, we managed to actually get the developer off the game, in a way, and convince the town hall that they had to do something with it. So after about, I think it was about 2.5 months or 3 months of negotiations and presentations to them, they decided that the architect of the town was in fact going to master plan and perhaps build and take care of the whole site. Then, to my surprise, about 7 months later, in December of, it was about 2 years ago now, they called up and they asked us to actually master plan it give them the annex to the documentation which has to go to the town hall in order for them to regulate all building which is going to happen on the site. Now, the whole idea was, after the negotiations and the presentations that we had made with La Première Rue throughout, was that in the central area, it's a site which used to be an old, how do we say, caserne de gendarmerie? It's barracks, absolutely, yeah, police barracks, and so the whole area was in fact walled in, and this central area, Zone B, is quite a dense, beautifully constructed square with 4 1930s buildings with very, very bright colors on it, and about 35 to 40 trees, about 70 years old. And the idea was to keep that central square, which already constitutes an order into the area, and begin to reorganize and look and rethink the other areas around it. So eventually they become 3 distinct zones, nevertheless with a connection through the axes and also through the punching through these existing buildings which are on that central square in the middle. The plexi blocks are in fact the zones which one can actually build, and the rest of the ground has been remodeled and is being actually constructed right now. Now, this is, I think I'm doing okay with time. This is the last project which we won about a year ago. It's a renovation for a housing block in Sarcelles, which is the suburbs of Paris. It's an existing block of flats with, at the moment, 34 apartments in them, to be converted into 50 flats, 6 of which are for, or rather 16 of which are for old age pensioners, what the French call troisième âge, or the third age, or the third cycle, and 4 of which are for young how can we call that? They're basically young people that are unemployed or have difficulties and can't pay rent, and therefore, as in lieu of paying rent, they would be taking care of these old age pensioners. Now, the competition organizers had shortlisted 4 groups of architects. The client is one of the largest clients in France in terms of building housing schemes, and they own about 2/3 of the area of Sarcelles itself. Out of 9,000 housing schemes, they actually own 6,000 flats. Now, out of 9,000, not housing schemes, but flats, they own 6,000. These are the 2 competition panels. You see the shortlisted competitions in France, you have 2 panels, 1.20 m by 90 centimeters. You have the position of your plan, almost. You have the position of the section, the plan masse, and that's about what you can sort of jiggle around in these 2 panels. The idea was, or the competition brief was asking for the renovation of this building over here. And the problem of Sarcelles, one of the problems of Sarcelles is, well, it's actually a suburb that was planned and built in the 1950s. It was finished in 1963. It's a series of bars going from about 50 meters length to about 300 meters length. The height of the suburb is mostly ground floor plus 4, and then that just repeats itself over about an area of, I would say, 8 kilometers by 4. Now, what happens on the main plan of Sarcelles, there are all these areas which you have the vertical. If you think of a Van Doesburg drawing, that's the plan of Sarcelles. You have vertical and horizontals, and then the spaces in between, which are in fact the spaces of what is called gardens, are completely untreated. Sarcelles is a suburb where it's known for its population of immigrants, drug dealings, and all the problems that you could think of. And so there was the first thing to begin to actually think about was to somehow bring into visibility these areas which are left behind or kept in the middle of the vertical and the horizontal bars. Now, one way to deal with that was to open up the ground and allow the right in front of the building, the existing building, in fact, there's an avenue which about 3 days a week there's a market that happens there, a huge market where from all other suburbs of Paris people come to Sarcelles as well for this market, and it's pretty well known, and it becomes very, very active, and it sort of gets into the not into the ground floor of the building, because the ground floor of the building at the moment is closed, but sort of spreads itself out all around the building. So one of the thoughts was actually to open up completely the ground floor of the building and allow somehow both the market and the so that's a view of actually Sarcelles. That's a photograph done in the 1960s, which is quite impressive. Well, we've taken it and sort of cut it into pieces and collaged it all over. But that's basically the way that the building sits within its context. And the idea was to bring out these two parts together through a space where we wouldn't actually allocate to apartments. The existing entries to the block are happening from the garden side at the moment, from here, because the garden is in fact at the moment at this level. And the idea was to reverse that and bring the entries from the ground floor, because we were keeping the 3 main stacks of the entries on the block for cost reasons mainly, and to create another block, another 2 blocks in fact, one which has on each floor the 4 one apartment each, which are in fact apartments that are going to be in direct liaison with the old age pensioners' apartment on the other side, with a split level difference, in order to allow those kids to have their own life in their block, but at the same time be quite near to the other flats that happen on the other side, and also create this other communal space, which is for the old age pensioners in order to receive their family. So the crossing of these three elements, meaning the existing building, the mini tower, and the other block, becomes the main entry to the building, which you'll see in the crossing of these 3. Now, those are basically the elevations. The project at the moment is is on the shelf. It's stopped. We have had planning permissions, and any day is supposed to pick up again on site. The problem is that the second planning permission is ready, because due to difficulties of the client with budget and financing, the budget has been actually reduced by about 35%, and therefore the building has undergone quite a lot of changes, in fact. Now, the new scheme is this one. We've blocked all the windows, by the way. We don't give them light anymore either. And we've just said, okay, the only thing that you can have is the ground level and the light, and that's about it.
No roof.
No roof. The roof, yeah, it actually comes right through the roof. Now, this is the last one, in fact, and it was, well, I'll just read this to you. February 95, a place, a Eurostar bar, conversation between an American businessman and Nasrine. Do you live in London? No, I teach in London. What do you teach? Architecture. Oh, so you teach the theory of architecture? No, I teach what my practice has taught me. So a teacher of architecture also practices. You see, our house burned down about 2 years ago, and since then, my wife and I, have been struggling to build another house. Every time that we meet an architect, we end up paying $2,000 and finishing with a drawing of a traditional house with a pitched roof. Would you like another drink? No, thank you, I'm fine. But tell me more about what kind of house you have in mind. Well, you see, the problem is that we don't really know. We shall be shortly at Waterloo, where this train terminates. It was a pleasure talking to you. Here's my card, just in case you would like us to do a couple of sketches for you. I'm sure my wife would be delighted to work with a woman architect, but the way my name, by the way, my name is Marvin Winkelman, just in case you receive a fax from us. Well, 10 days later, I think it was end of February actually, we did receive a fax. And the fax said, I hope you remember our conversation on Eurostar. We have prepared a package with photographs of the site and some brief information which we hope is going to help you to begin designing the house. Looking forward to seeing you in Washington at the end of May when we shall take you to see the site. Well, that's what I showed them last time that I was in Washington, and we're just beginning to design the house. Thank you.
It's a really happy story. I love that. Question.
Yes. They were there, yeah. I mean, I should have actually read you a piece by Catherine Ingraham, which I probably just forgot to read it, but she describes that quite beautifully. So.
What, the trees already being there?
Yeah.
Designing the building?
Yeah, the trees were there. I mean, the 3 rows of the trees were there. Yeah. Well, cutting them up, yeah. Chopping them up, rather. Anything else? Thank you.
Good.
Look.